February 1944. The snow outside Wright Field, Ohio, had crusted into gray ridges that glittered under the morning sun. Inside Building 5, the air was thick with the smell of oil, paper, and cold coffee. Around a scarred oak table sat a group of officers and engineers whose expressions gave nothing away. On the wall behind them, a chalkboard was covered in figures that didn't belong in any standard performance manual. 64 inches, one colonel murmured, tapping the chalk against the board. That's beyond the detonation threshold. At the far end of the table, a Pratt Whitney engineer adjusted his glasses. Not anymore, he said quietly. Not with injection. He unrolled a set of temperature plots showing intake air readings that had stunned even the test crew. With anti-detonant injection, a mixture of water and methanol, the R-2800 double wasp didn't melt under stress. It thrived. The charts showed stable combustion at pressures no pilot had dared use before. Engines that had once plateaued at 56 inches of manifold pressure now screamed past 60 without tearing themselves apart. The promise was intoxicating. It meant more climb, more acceleration, more control when survival came down to seconds. Yet the faces around the table stayed cautious. Every officer there remembered what happened when doctrine was broken. In the corner of the room, a young test pilot named Major Ben Hathaway stood silent, his logbook still open from that morning's flight. He'd pushed the prototype P-47D past its limits over the frozen Ohio flatlands, and for the first time, the jug hadn't groaned. It had leapt. Halfway through the meeting, a slide projector clattered to life, filling the wall with the image of a Luftwaffe intercept chart captured by British intelligence. The Germans still believed the Thunderbolt to be a lumbering ground attack brute, a target, not a threat. Hathaway felt something burn behind his ribs. They had no idea what was coming. If you want to uncover the forgotten secrets that rewrote World War II's air war, subscribe now and join us as we dive deeper into the machines that defied belief. As the projector clicked off, silence reclaimed the room. Orders were signed. Tests were authorized. Within days, the modification kits would be shipped to Eglin Field, Florida, for operational trials. Outside, the February wind carried the distant roar of another R-2800 starting up. In that sound lay the beginning of something Germany had never expected. A Thunderbolt reborn through fire, pressure, and water. March 1944, Eglin Field, Florida. The heat shimmered above the concrete as the first P-47D rolled out onto the test line, its new engine cowling marked with red stencil warnings, water injection equipped. The system looked unremarkable. A small cylindrical tank behind the cockpit, a network of narrow pipes running into the induction manifold, and a single toggle switch on the throttle quadrant marked WEP, engage. But beneath that simplicity lay a breakthrough so radical that even its creators couldn't predict what it would do to the war. The test pilot that morning, Captain Joe Toth, climbed into the cockpit with the easy confidence of a man who'd spent too many hours wrestling this heavy fighter through humid southern skies. The maintenance crew stepped back, hands over their ears, as the double wasp coughed, spat, and then settled into a thunderous idle that made the hangar walls vibrate. The temperature was already 84 degrees before noon. Every flight at Eglin felt like flying inside an oven. At 10:17 a.m., the tower cleared him for takeoff. The jug accelerated sluggishly at first, its 13-foot propeller clawing the air, but as Toth reached for the toggle and pressed it forward, a brief hesitation was followed by a deep, visceral roar that felt almost animal. The manifold pressure needle jumped from 56 to 64 inches, and the entire aircraft seemed to surge with new life. The water-methanol mixture hissed through the system, cooling the combustion chambers and suppressing detonation before it could begin. Climbing through 5,000 feet, Toth called over the radio, his voice incredulous. "She's pulling steady at 64, he said. "Temperature's nominal, power holding." The ground telemetry crew exchanged looks of disbelief. The data coming in didn't belong to a 13,000-pound airplane. It belonged to a fighter that could now climb faster than a Messerschmitt Bf-109 at low altitude. Down on the tarmac, engineers scribbled notes while a senior colonel murmured under his breath, "If this holds up in Europe, we just changed the game." Every landing that week brought more proof. Cylinder head temperatures remained stable. Fuel pressure stayed within limits. Detonation was almost non-existent. The Pratt Whitney engineers had done it. The Thunderbolt had become a high-altitude interceptor, a low-level brawler, and a strategic weapon all at once. By month's end, Air Materiel Command would issue a formal order authorizing 64 inches of manifold pressure under war emergency power. It was more than a technical note. It was permission to unleash the full fury of American engineering. By late April 1944, the skies over East Anglia throbbed with the mechanical pulse of hundreds of radial engines as the 8th Air Force prepared for what it called Operation Argument, though history would remember it as Big Week. Across the dispersal fields of Duxford, Debden and Leiston, maintenance crews huddled around P-47Ds, freshly fitted with the revised R-2800 59 engines and their new anti-detonation injection tanks, gleaming like polished metal under the morning mist. Each aircraft carried the faint scent of methanol that lingered even after the tanks were sealed, a reminder that chemistry, not luck, was about to redraw the balance of aerial power over Europe. At briefing rooms filled with the smell of cigarette smoke and damp wool, pilots listened as intelligence officers outlined expected Luftwaffe resistance. The Germans still fielded formidable machines, Bf-109 G6s and Fw-190 A8s, but their tactical assumptions were outdated. They believed the Thunderbolt remained a ponderous escort, unable to match their climb or acceleration. No one in the Reich Air Ministry yet understood that a single toggle switch labeled WEP had rewritten every performance chart the Luftwaffe trusted. When the first modified units, 56th Fighter Group under Colonel Hubert Hub Zemke, received the updated maintenance circular from Air Materiel Command, skepticism mixed with curiosity. Pilots were warned that the system's methanol-water mixture must be primed before combat, and that failure of the injection pump could destroy an engine in seconds if the throttle remained forward. Zemke, pragmatic and fearless, ordered controlled tests during escort runs to Bremen and Hanover. The results stunned even him. At 25,000 feet, engaging the injection produced an immediate surge of thrust, the needle on the manifold gauge snapping to 64 inches as the propeller bit deeper into the thin air. The jug, once dismissed as sluggish, now climbed like a hungry predator, its Pratt Whitney engine bellowing with renewed ferocity. In mock engagements, pilots reported outrunning Focke-Wulfs in level flight, something previously considered impossible. One after-action report summarized the transformation in dry military prose. Engine response markedly improved. Pursuit performance now competitive with enemy types in all regimes. Ground intelligence units intercepted frantic Luftwaffe transmissions referring to new American supercharger boost and chemical motor power, but they couldn't decipher its nature. German pilots began calling the upgraded P-47s Donnerschlag, Thunderstrike. By June, these aircraft escorted bombers deeper into the continent than ever before, carving through intercept formations with methodical precision. The Thunderbolt, reborn through chemistry and courage, had crossed an invisible threshold, from a misunderstood brute into an apex predator of the European sky. While American test pilots in Florida and England were pushing the boundaries of engine physics, the Luftwaffe's intelligence apparatus continued to cling to outdated assessments drawn from the previous year's encounters. In Berlin, within the marble halls of the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, intelligence officers compiled reports suggesting that the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, though robust and heavily armed, was little more than a flying fortress escort with limited agility and range. German engineers at Focke-Wulf and Messerschmitt regarded it as a secondary threat, useful perhaps for ground attack, but no match for the lean, aerodynamic hunters that had ruled the skies since 1939. To them, the Jug was an overweight anomaly, a relic of America's obsession with mass and firepower rather than finesse. Analysts cited the Thunderbolt's takeoff weight, often exceeding 13,000 pounds, as proof of its inferiority in sustained maneuver combat. Their data tables showed climb rates inferior to the Bf-109G6 and top speeds trailing the FW-190A8 by a narrow but critical margin. What they did not know, and what German pilots would soon discover in the most brutal way possible, was that every one of those tables had become obsolete the moment American engineers unlocked 64 inches of manifold pressure. During debriefings from the Jagdgeschwader 26 Schlageter and JG-2 Richthofen, veteran pilots noted curious discrepancies. The Thunderbolts they faced in spring 1944 seemed to climb harder and sustain turns longer than before, particularly above 15,000 feet. Some dismissed it as improved American tactics or the use of lighter fuel loads. Others suspected a new engine variant but had no confirmation. Even the respected ace Adolf Galland, inspector of fighters, received contradictory intelligence reports, one calling the P-47 a lumbering escort, another labeling it unusually fast at altitude. By May, Luftwaffe commanders were beginning to realize something had changed. Formation intercepts that once ended predictably with the heavy Thunderbolts breaking off were now turning into lethal engagements. German pilots who dove upon the jugs expecting easy kills often found themselves trapped as the American fighters climbed back up with astonishing acceleration, their turbo superchargers howling like mechanical sirens. The Luftwaffe's underestimation had strategic consequences far beyond individual dogfights. Tactical directives based on old intelligence persisted too long, instructing pilots to attack Thunderbolts head-on or from above, tactics that now carried deadly risk. The American aircraft's new burst of power made such approaches suicidal. The German Air Force, once the most technologically advanced in the world, had fallen into its own illusion, believing the war in the air could still be dictated by experience and instinct. It failed to see that by 1944, chemistry, data, and engineering had become the new weapons of dominance. June 6, 1944, D-Day. The largest armada in human history stretched across the English Channel, and above it, the sky belonged to thunder. Hundreds of P-47 Thunderbolts roared eastward from fields in southern England, their wings loaded with bombs, rockets, and machine gun belts gleaming in the morning light. The mission was brutal in simplicity: clear the beaches, cripple the railways, and silence every gun that dared fire upon the invasion fleet. For the men who flew the Jug, it was the ultimate test of the new war emergency power system, now cleared for full combat use. Each pilot carried a small, laminated card taped beside his throttle. A quick reference for manifold pressures, fuel flow, and the precious toggle that read, "Water injection, on." The difference between engaging it at the right moment and hesitating for 2 seconds could mean survival or death. As the Thunderbolts descended through the low gray clouds over Normandy, tracer fire stitched the sky in chaotic arcs. Lieutenant Robert "Punchy" Powell of the 510th Fighter Squadron pushed his throttle forward until the detent clicked, flooding the engine with the methanol-water mixture. Instantly, the R-2800 roared beyond its normal range, and the Jug seemed to leap forward with unnatural force, clawing through flak bursts that shredded the air like black glass. Below, the beaches of Omaha and Utah were hell on earth. German anti-aircraft batteries hammered the sky from concealed hedgerows and bunkers, but the Thunderbolts came in relentless waves, strafing gun positions, exploding trucks, and tearing through rail lines that fed reinforcements toward the front. In just 2 days, the 56th, 78th, and 362nd Fighter Groups destroyed more than 700 vehicles and 120 locomotives, their pilots returning home with faces blackened by smoke and disbelief at what their machines could endure. One report described how a P-47 took a direct hit from an 88mm shell, lost 3 feet of wingtip, and still flew back to base on one engine cylinder misfiring. Mechanics later counted 47 holes in the fuselage. The pilot had flown 80 miles home under full emergency power, his ADI system sputtering but unbroken. For the Luftwaffe, this was the nightmare made real. Their flak divisions radioed frantic messages: "The heavy American fighters do not break off." What once was mocked as a clumsy escort had transformed into a weapon of unstoppable momentum. By the end of June, The Allied armies had secured a foothold in France, and the Thunderbolt had earned its legend not in theory or testing, but in fire, noise, and the brutal proof of survival. To most pilots, war emergency power was a switch that turned fear into acceleration. But beneath that simplicity lay one of the most ingenious applications of chemistry in aviation history. The principle behind anti-detonant injection, or ADI, wasn't magic. It was thermodynamics married to desperation. In every high-performance piston engine, the limit of power was the limit of temperature. Compress air and fuel too much, and the mixture ignites prematurely, detonating with a violence that can shatter pistons, crack cylinder heads, and destroy an engine in seconds. Engineers had fought that boundary for years, adding octane, redesigning spark timing, improving cooling. But by 1943, even the mighty Pratt Whitney R-2800 had reached its edge. Then came a deceptively simple idea. Introduce water. Not as fuel, but as a temporary coolant. When injected into the intake manifold as a fine mist mixed with 30% methanol, water absorbed vast amounts of heat through vaporization, cooling the compressed air-fuel charge before ignition. This reduction in temperature delayed detonation long enough for more fuel to be burned safely at higher manifold pressures. The methanol served both as an antifreeze and as a combustion stabilizer, ensuring consistent ignition even at extreme boost. The mixture, pressurized at 23 psi, flowed through fine jets at roughly 2.1 gallons per minute, a delicate balance between chemistry and engineering precision. At Wright Field, technicians ran engines until the exhaust stacks glowed cherry red, their instruments trembling under vibration. The data told a story that seemed almost fictional. Temperatures dropped by 90 degrees, cylinder pressures stabilized, and detonation virtually vanished even at 64 inches of manifold pressure. With ADI engaged, the same engine that once risked failure after 2 minutes of full power could now sustain combat thrust for over 5 minutes, an eternity when being chased by a Messerschmitt. There were drawbacks. The mixture was heavy, corrosive, and required separate tanks that reduced space for ammunition or fuel. Methanol's toxic fumes made ground servicing dangerous, and accidental leaks could eat through paint within hours. Yet none of it mattered, because what ADI offered was time. Those brief moments in which survival hinged on outrunning, outclimbing, or outgunning the enemy. For the men flying Thunderbolts across occupied Europe, that hiss of fluid behind their seat wasn't just chemistry, it was life distilled into vapor. In every drop of water methanol coursing through the lines lay the silent promise that their engines would not betray them when the sky turned red. By the late summer of 1944, as the Allies advanced deeper into occupied Europe, the Luftwaffe unveiled a weapon that seemed to belong to another age. The Messerschmitt May 262, the world's first operational jet fighter, appeared over Germany with a speed so terrifying that American bomber crews at first mistook it for a rocket. Propelled by two Jumo 004B turbojets, it could exceed 540 miles per hour, faster than anything with a propeller had ever flown. In theory, it rendered the prop-driven fighter obsolete overnight. Yet war, as it often does, favored those who adapted faster rather than those who invented first, and the Americans had just armed their Thunderbolts with something the Germans didn't expect: instant chemical fury. When the Me-262s of JG-7 Nowotny began intercepting B-17 formations near Leipzig and Kassel, P-47 groups were already adjusting tactics. Rather than chase the jets, they hunted the moment before and after each attack, when the German aircraft slowed to land or accelerate. Pilots like Captain Ben Mayo and Lieutenant Ralph Johnson discovered that engaging war emergency power gave the jug a short burst of thrust so violent it could close distance on a jet for just long enough to shoot. Reports from late August confirmed 2 Me-262s destroyed by Thunderbolts during approach phases, an outcome few believed possible only months earlier. On one mission near Emden, Lieutenant Melvin McNichol of the 56th Fighter Group witnessed a jet streak past his formation and dive for the airfield below. McNichol slammed the throttle forward, activating water injection, feeling the surge of 64 inches of manifold pressure, as the heavy fighter seemed to shed its weight and plunge after the enemy. The Me-262, bleeding speed as it lined up for landing, never made it. Two short bursts from McNichol's .850 caliber guns tore through the right engine nacelle, sending the jet sliding across the runway in a ball of flame. Intelligence later confirmed the kill as one of the first piston-engine victories against a jet. German pilots, once contemptuous of the Thunderbolt, now spoke of its uncanny persistence. The Me-262 was faster, but the P-47 could stay in the fight longer, take hits that would obliterate lighter planes, and deliver punishment with unflinching precision. The Luftwaffe's last advantage, speed, had been blunted by American chemistry. As autumn arrived, the jet age began not with triumph, but with smoke, debris, and disbelief that a water-cooled radial could bring down the future. By the final months of 1944, while Europe lay fractured under the relentless advance of Allied armies, the true engine of victory was turning thousands of miles away across the Atlantic. From Bridgeport, Connecticut to Evansville, Indiana, assembly lines thrummed with a rhythm that echoed the pulse of an industrial giant awakening to full war tempo. The Republic Aviation Corporation, whose factory floors glowed beneath skylights dusted with aluminum shavings, had become a machine in its own right, one that could produce a brand new P-47 Thunderbolt every 56 minutes. In parallel, Pratt Whitney's East Hartford plant poured out hundreds of R-2800 double wasp engines each week, their workers mastering tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Every piston, bearing, and magneto carried the invisible imprint of an entire nation's determination to never again lose the initiative in the sky. Unlike Germany, whose aviation production was crippled by constant bombing and logistical scarcity, the United States had achieved the industrial miracle of redundancy. Components from different factories, cowling panels from Farmingdale, turbo superchargers from General Electric's Lynn division, propellers from Hamilton Standard, arrived at assembly depots where teams of young technicians, many barely out of high school, fitted them together with near religious precision. Women working 12-hour shifts riveted fuselage sections, while listening to the drone of engines being tested outside. They didn't know it then, but their efforts gave life to the very aircraft that would shield thousands of bomber crews and change the fate of nations. By contrast, German engineers were forced to rely on underground workshops and improvised supply chains. The Reich's oil fields had been bombed into paralysis, and its aluminum reserves dwindled to the point that even Me-262 jet production fell short of half its target. While the Luftwaffe's fuel-starved pilots were being trained in simulators made from stripped aircraft frames, American replacements trained in the open skies of Texas, Arizona, and Florida. Every statistic told the same story. By late 1944, the Allies were producing more fighters each month than Germany could in an entire quarter. But quantity was only half the story. Quality had caught up. Each Thunderbolt leaving the line came with refined controls, water injection systems pre-calibrated for combat reliability, and improved canopy visibility for low-level strikes. The evolution of the Jug wasn't just mechanical, it was systemic, the embodiment of how democracy, industry, and discipline could converge into a weapon of endurance. When the war in Europe reached its crescendo, it wasn't only pilots who had earned victory, it was the men and women who had built, fueled, and maintained a fleet that simply refused to stop flying. For the men who strapped themselves into the cockpit of the Thunderbolt, power wasn't just a number measured in manifold inches or horsepower. It was a sensation that lived in the muscles, in the nerves, in the quiet fear that every sortie could be the last. Pilots who had flown the earlier models remembered the frustration of watching German fighters climb away, taunting them from above the contrails, while the heavy Jug labored to respond. But after the arrival of war emergency power, everything changed. That single switch transformed anxiety into control. They could feel it the moment they pushed the throttle past its limit, the sudden lurch, the metallic growl of the R-2800, and the faint vibration under the floorboards that told them the injection system was alive. In that instant, the aircraft became something almost sentient, responding with raw obedience to the pilot's will. Lieutenant Francis Gabreski, one of America's leading aces, once described it as riding the edge of destruction. The line between command and catastrophe was thin. Misuse of the system could overheat the engine in minutes, turning power into peril. Yet those who mastered it spoke of an almost spiritual connection between man and machine. The Thunderbolt didn't flatter its pilot. It demanded respect, rewarded precision, and punished arrogance. There was no glamour in it, no sleekness like the Mustang, but an unyielding strength that felt almost human in its resilience. Veteran pilots from the 56th Fighter Group often said they could sense when their aircraft wanted to fight. At altitude, the ADI system gave them confidence that even if the engine was pushed to its limits, it wouldn't quit. That assurance, combined with the Jug's heavy armor and immense firepower, changed the psychology of combat. They attacked more aggressively, stayed longer in dogfights, and dove into engagements others might have avoided. But the emotional toll remained immense. Each mission carried the smell of burnt oil and the echo of lost friends. The men who returned from sorties often sat in silence beside their grounded aircraft, staring at the steam rising from their cowling vents, knowing that for every burst of power that saved them, someone else hadn't been so lucky. To them, war emergency power was more than a mechanical function. It was a fragile pact between courage and consequence. Every time that switch was flipped, they risked their lives for a few stolen seconds of advantage, and in those seconds, the fate of skies, and of nations, was often decided. When the guns fell silent in 1945 and the engines cooled on Europe's scarred airfields, the P-47 Thunderbolt stood as both a relic and a revelation. Its thick armor and monstrous engine, once symbols of brute strength, had defined an era of warfare that valued resilience over elegance. But as jets like the P-80 Shooting Star sliced through the skies, the piston engine's thunder began to fade into history. Yet for those who had witnessed the Jug in its prime, the sound of its R-2800 double wasp was more than noise. It was the heartbeat of American industrial might. Historians now view the P-47 as the ultimate expression of wartime necessity, the fusion of engineering audacity and mass production genius. Over 15,600 units were built, each a flying fortress capable of surviving damage that would tear lesser aircraft apart. In the final months of the war, Thunderbolts roamed the skies above Germany, tearing through rail yards, fuel depots, and armored convoys with impunity. It wasn't just a fighter. It was a symbol of endurance, of how America's factories had turned raw metal into power that could bend history itself. But its legacy wasn't purely mechanical. The Thunderbolt reshaped doctrines of air combat. It taught commanders that survivability and firepower could be as decisive as agility. It redefined the relationship between pilot and machine, introducing technologies like water methanol injection, turbo supercharging, and self-sealing fuel systems that would echo into the jet age. Even its shortcomings became lessons that paved the way for future designs. For the pilots who had lived through it, the Jug was a paradox. It was ungainly yet invincible, slow to climb yet unstoppable in a dive. It lacked the sleek beauty of the Mustang or the romantic aura of the Spitfire. But when survival was measured in seconds, it was the Jug they trusted. They called it a flying anvil, and yet in their hands, it became a sword. Today, restored Thunderbolts rumble across the skies during air shows, their propellers clawing the air as spectators look up in awe. Few realize that those wings once carried men into storms of flak and fire, their courage amplified by a roar of horsepower that shook the heavens. In the end, the P-47 Thunderbolt wasn't just an aircraft, it was an era's defiance forged in aluminum and steel. It proved that power, when guided by human spirit, could carve its name into eternity.